KPFA Radio presents Upfront, a show that delivers a mix of local, state, and international coverage through challenging interviews, civil debates, breaking updates, and in-depth discussions with authors, hosted by Brian Edwards-Tiekert. Please enjoy this episode of Upfront that previously aired live on KPFA Radio.
Our next guest is much more concerned with differences among all the rest of us. Particularly how existing elites who are clear-eyed about climate change are thinking about how to stay wealthy and powerful on a warming planet, what political openings there are for everyone who is not wealthy and powerful. Ajay Singh Chaudhary comes from a background in social and political theory, but took a prolonged detour through the scientific literature on the climate crisis to get to the basic question of how the climate change we are actually experiencing shapes our politics, how it changes alignments and coalitions, and why a lot of the stories that we tell ourselves about climate change help us get the politics wrong. Ajay Singh Chaudhary is executive director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, now out with the book The Exhausted of the Earth, What's Up, Frantz Fanon, subtitled Politics in a Burning World. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
What did you think was missing from the literature when you started this project?
Oh, that's a great question. When I first started, there wasn't even that much, I feel like, even it was just the burgeoning era of like left policy about climate. And there was some, but very nascent writing about politics of climate. But as the project was going, I feel like actually where you started your intro is one of the things I started really honing in on, which was that like denialism, even in the United States, it is now a minority position, even on the right. There is no such thing as anthropogenic climate change. So one of the reasons why the book starts there, and I'm really glad that you started the intro there, is in fact, I still think that in the sort of mainstream political debate, like on Congress, or the mainstream media debate that you will hear, talking heads on the TV going on about, it's still like this on-off switch about climate, right? It's like, I don't want to like make anyone feel bad, but right, it's just like in this house we believe in science, and then there's the like, look, my snowball is not melting on the floor of Congress, right? And like, the first thing that's funny about that, right, is like science is not supposed to be the kind of thing that you have to like have a Kierkegaardian leap of faith to get behind, right? It's a probabilistic portrait of how the universe is, how our world is, how things function, right? But the other side of that is when you really start digging in, as I did, you don't actually find even, yes, you've got your crazies, right? So you've got, I'll use Trump. He's very easy, right? He says it's an evil Chinese hoax, right? But the people like he works for, so like larger corporations, sorry to be so brazen about this. I am a Marxist, so that's just the way it is. It's also true. But right, and the people who work under him are not like, oh, it's a crazy Chinese hoax, right? The people who are, for example, writing policy under the Trump administration were doing things like saying, oh, this is how we have to retrofit the military, aircraft carriers, to deal with a higher sea level or greater salinization. They'll do things like support higher border policy, sometimes explicitly citing climate migration. They'll do things like focus a lot on seawalls and adaptation to protect, valuable assets while drowning, say, poorer parts. And I'm not just here talking about the global south, as we often do, which we should. It's very important. But I'm big, I'm from New York, right? So like if you look at some of the seawalls that have been proposed to say, save lower parts of Manhattan, they drown the poorer parts of Brooklyn and Queens. In the book, I start here, right? I call it right-wing climate realism. Like these are very hardcore right-wing people. I use Rex Tillerson as my example because I did start writing this in the Trump years. But they're not deniers. They're looking at the same spreadsheets, the same data I am, right? And they're being like, oh, okay, so you're telling me if I do this super fast, I lose $40 trillion in the next couple of years. And if I do this slow and moderate, 1 billion people maybe die, but maybe I have a 50-50 shot of holding my wealth, my power, and my life. If I'm this right-wing climate realist kind of guy, Rex Tillerson, whoever, I like that coin flip. That's a good coin flip. Whereas, as you said, sort of the rest of us, we need the mitigation to be and adaptation to be as thorough and as swift as possible. And it's actually these timescales that are defining, I think, the sort of growing breach over climate politics right now.
Because slow walking the climate response changes who wins and who loses.
Oh,
and by how
absolutely.
much.
And not just that. And this is actually one of the other reasons I wrote this book is, as much as I have my roots in many different, political traditions and theories, it's very unusual to have something that's like, oh, I've got 5 to 10 years. And if I don't get my project done in those 5 to 10 years, it's over. Even your most radical political theories you mentioned Fanon, right? Anti-colonialism. He does feel that urgency very strongly. But it's like if you lose that war, well, you fight the next one. Marxists, right? It's like, okay, the revolution didn't work out that time, but maybe next time, right? But this is really different because if we do not, in fact, succeed at the forms of mitigation and adaptation that are best for the vast majority of people, we will be locked out of that convivial sort of ecological niche for so many people pretty much forever in human terms, not forever in like cosmic terms.
So the kind of climate pragmatism embraced by the right that you were describing, military planners thinking about how to change the specs on their ships, politicians beefing up border security because they're worried about climate migrancy.
Yeah, it's huge in Europe too, that one. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, the so-called Green-Black Alliance.
Yeah, the Green-Black Alliance. And no, I was thinking of the Frontex, like they're starting the EU Navy pretty much built around migrants across the Mediterranean. Sorry.
So you call this armed lifeboat pragmatism.
Yes.
What's the alternative?
Oh, great. So I should say I stole that phrase, the politics of the armed lifeboat, from Christian Parenti. And he has different views on it. It's fine. But the opposite of that really is, and we see it emerging. I spent a long time in the book talking about existing movements. Those are largely in the global south. We do, of course, have movements here in the global north, but we are in some ways playing catch up, both in terms of scale and in terms of strategy and tactics. So the opposite of what I call, this is not maybe rocket science, but the opposite of what I call right-wing climate realism, I call left-wing climate realism, right? Which is, in a nutshell, a politics of climate mitigation and adaptation that is geared towards the needs of the vast majority of people on Earth, both north and south. And the other way I just talk about it in the book, in fact, as part of the allusion to the title, is both as a sort of broadened attempt at decolonization that also includes the global north, and also as a politics of exhaustion, right? Because part of what the book traces is that many of the same forces that in fact are wearing out or destroying or devastating various ecosystems and our Earth system altogether are exactly the same ones that are wearing people down. And in fact, there's also a causal relationship. You actually, as I try to show in the second chapter, there's a causal relationship between these things. Between like, the joke I make is like our ecological niche has a case of the Mondays, right? Right? Like, you are being enabled to, for example, I actually use an example of someone here in California who's like a middle-class worker. Maybe they work in tech, maybe they work in accounting, whatever, doesn't matter. But right, like all the forces that are tiring that person out, right, and allowing them to work longer hours for shorter pay are like the same things spewing more throughput material use, more emissions into the atmosphere, and also, frankly, like enslaving people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, bleaching coral reefs over in the Philippines, which then the labor migration, oh, great, cheap labor, right? And so we see a lot of people who nominally, in a lot of political analyses, feel like, what does this guy from California and this woman from the Philippines and this guy in the Congo have in common? Very little. But all of a sudden, when you look through the lens of climate and of exhaustion, you're like, oh no, these people have a ton in common. And it's not just some like abstract moral principle. They actually are being buffeted and their lives are being destroyed by the same forces.
And your argument is that this is different. In a prior era, the working class of an imperial power might not have the same common cause or political alignment with the working class in an imperialized country. The classic example would be textile mill workers in England were being employed because of the mercantilist exploitation of people, British subjects in India.
Yeah. Strangely, for someone like me who has his roots in critical theory and Marxism and also in anti-colonial thought, a lot of this stuff actually comes out of like analytic Marxism and also analytic sociology and things like this, American and British. And if you think of in sort of really rank, base, empirical interest kind of language, right? If it's like the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and I work for Ford, actually what's good for Ford is good for me, and what's good for America is good for Ford. Right? That's pretty easy, right? Now, that doesn't mean that what's good for me and working at Ford is also good for, say, where someone working the rubber plantation or something like that, right? So that's like a really easy way of thinking about this. But actually, one of the weird sides of both climate politics and also the way in which our global economy has changed, right? We no longer have Fordist factories. Now, I usually use my cell phone as the example. This isn't made in one place. This is made in like 80-something places. And so part of what happens there is there's actually an opportunity, believe it or not, in this kind of incredibly ecologically and socially devastating form of production. And what is that opportunity? That opportunity is, in fact, that people's, at this very basic level, it's no longer the case. Like maybe I work for Apple, maybe I work for Amazon, right? Maybe I'm a coder, maybe I'm a warehouse worker, maybe I'm someone who does maintenance on the fiber optic cables, all kinds of stuff, right? But it's not always clear that what's good for Amazon is now good for me. And also, I am being surveilled at work or even being attacked at work by some of the same private security firms and things like this that are surveilling and patrolling, in these extractive sites in Central Africa, in South America, and so on and so forth.
But where do you see actual examples of that kind of the kind of cross-border solidarity that you would expect from that?
La Via Campesina is probably the most famous, you know them, right? Sort of international peasant movement, but also with a lot of ties across the Spanish-speaking world, including into Europe. And so I think that's a nice example of, like, if I compare them to the Audubon Society, they're doing way more advanced and much more radical work. And they're doing it cross borders with huge numbers of people. And yes, while they are mostly a peasant movement, they have lots of connections with, for example, unionized industrial workers in various places and also intelligentsia in various parts of the world. So like you do see these nascent forms that I feel like in the North, we should be learning a lot from, like, oh, what are those guys doing?
I get it. La Via Campesina is a great organization, but they are not people involved in globally distributed supply chains recognizing a climate plight because of the current mode of production.
Yeah. I mean, ag, on the one hand, you're right. Like, it's not quite the cell phone. But on the other hand, agricultural supply chains are actually pretty complex right now. I mean, one of the things that I actually am not sure I got into enough in the book, but has come up as I'm doing these sort of conversations, is even stuff that feels very, very, very local, right? Like electrification right here, right in a place like the Bay. When you start thinking about, like, where are the various parts coming from? Where are the batteries being made? Where's the various other pieces of technology, or especially like sub pieces, business stuff? It's being produced all over the world in like many different kinds of places. So things like ag can be considered distributed. But yes, you're right. We know we do not yet have too much of the kind of total supply chain organizing, although there are a lot of folks who are trying to do this. And part of my argument and part of my sort of belief in this is that we're seeing more and more of it. You are seeing people who are at least or at least have the knowledge of how these systems work. A lot of this was kind of a black box until the last 20 or 30 years, you actually started being able to see some of it. So there are people sort of theorizing it and working on it, and some of it has started to happen, but again, not enough. So there have been, for example, in the past many months, not always around climate, but certainly thinking across the supply chain. I use the more technical lingo in the book, right? The value chain, the global value chain, where people will be like, oh, yes, part of my contract demand is that the guy in the intermediary, processor making plant should also have better health and safety, should also have a say in how the speed of production and things like this. So there is nascent forms of this, but you're absolutely right, if I'm being totally honest, that these things are underdeveloped and that we desperately need them to sort of ramp up.
I want to kind of reel us back into the question of explicitly climate responsive politics.
Yes, great.
You seem to have a lot of skepticism towards the techno-optimism
Oh boy.
that is particularly prevalent in eco-modernist circles. The idea that green technologies, both existing and yet to be developed, will scale up in time to solve things.
Yeah. I feel I always feel very self-conscious when I'm in the Bay Area talking about this stuff. Should I not be? It's funny because I do, again, it's almost like the same joke I did before with denialism and we in this house we believe in science, because I'm not like anti-tech. There are many pastoralists in the world. I would really like them to not get, dispossessed. And in fact, we can learn a lot about sustainable agriculture from those people. That said, I do not think all 8 billion currently living human beings are going to become like romantic pastoralists. That's like an insane proposition. So like, I'm not saying no technology, but a lot of folks will say something like this, like, it'll be that same argument I cited before. That's the Rex Tillerson position. That's the William Nordhaus, who won the fake Nobel in the economics for this, right? Being like, 3.5 degrees, 3 to 4, who cares? That's good enough. That's enough mitigation. And, if you talk to a lot of climate scientists, they're like, oh my God, you don't do that. That's crazy. But, right, they will say, and anything we can't do now, because it's too expensive, or they claim they're doing the kindness of their hearts for all of us poor people in the rest of the world. Right, that will use direct air capture, or will use carbon capture and storage, and then there's of course the people who are obsessive about nuclear power. And unfortunately, a lot of the answers here are really plain and obvious. So, like one thing I do in the book is I often go to the people who are most gung ho, but from a sort of a place of real learning, right? So, like one of the people I cite on carbon capture. This is like probably the top scientist in the world who works on carbon capture. He loves carbon capture. He's like, gung-ho, 100%, we should do some carbon capture. But he's also like, when he hears people make the political argument, which many folks do make, that we have to do that first, or that's like part of our energy transition. This guy who like specializes in this stuff is like, no, what are you talking about? This stuff is only going to be this tiny bit of things for hard to abate sectors way off in the future. If you do this before your energy transition, it actually turns out, and I read a ton of studies on this, that a lot of it's net negative. The most common use for captured carbon today is to actually, can I play teacher a little bit?
Sure.
What do you guess the most common use for high pressure captured carbon is today?
Am I going to disappoint you if I know?
No, not at all.
It's pumping it into existing oil wells to get more oil out of the ground.
Bingo. Yep. That and fracking. But yeah, bingo. And even if it wasn't, a lot of times, because of how much it takes to make this stuff, it can be net negative if it's running on a non-renewable power system, which, of course, that is what we currently have. So examples like that are really, I think, illuminating, because it sort of cuts through the spin that the sort of techno-optimists, I call them techno-mystics, because I'm so much of a modernist myself. To me, modernism is experimentalism. It's exciting. It's something different than the world is now, right? That's, to me, modernism. I don't want to give them that term. I call them techno-mystics because they just believe in technology. They just like believe in it as this like abstract force in human history, and they don't want to deal with biophysical limits at all. Right. And this is really funny because you find this again with your Bill Gateses, but you find a lot of folks, I'm sad to say, on the left, certainly in liberal center, but also even on the far left, who really just think it's a tech problem and like don't seem to think the laws of physics apply to them, and don't seem to care that we can't build a bajillion nuclear power plants in like 10 minutes. And plus me, as I record in the book, many countries have tried. So China in particular is probably the principal example. Why? China desperately would love to have nuclear power plants pop up all over the place so that they could clean up their production emissions, because they still make most of our stuff. They couldn't do it. And if they can't do it, probably none of us can. And also, as many of these engineering studies that I cite from other parts of the world, not from the United States, they're just like, it just seems this other stuff, right? Photovoltaic, wind, battery storage, or even like analog storage using like heat or using gravity, right? Like these kinds of things are at hand. We can get them right now. Same thing in the ag space, right? Agroecological practices, agroforestry. People have done a lot of good research. That is like, what's the policy phrase people use? That's shovel ready. You could start that tomorrow if you had the political will. But like you're like funny like lab meat, or you're funny like weird energy perpetual motion machine. Yeah, if you've got it hiding in your back pocket, I would love to see the scalable version, but we don't have that. And the same thing with direct air capture. I mean, there is, I think, one working facility currently in the world, and even the people who have made it and are very proud of it are like, oh, it's going to take forever to scale this, and we still don't even know where to put the damn stuff. So it's like these kinds of things, turning to technology only as a solution, is often just a sort of status quo apologia, right? Or apology, I should say, right? It's basically just saying, let's try to keep things the way they are now. And that's something else I try to focus on in the book. There's a lot of inchoate social upheaval right now. And a lot of it doesn't really code very easily. So if you look at part of the sort of techno-mystics, if you will, the techno-optimist sort of conviction, right, is like we have to keep the world exactly the same. So here are all these technological ways in which we can do so. And the funny thing is, if you look at these inchoate sort of movements around the world and reactions that don't yet politically code well, and I was thinking in the book I wrote about it, about farmers in the global south, also in North America, actually. But right now there's a bunch of farmer protests happening in Europe, and they're pretty hard to code politically. But in my mind, they are all examples of this sort of exhaustion that people have, this sort of like people being, I quote Fannie Lou Hamer in the book, being sick and tired of being sick and tired. And that doesn't actually have yet always a political, speaking back to your first question, actually, it doesn't always yet have a political valence. And a lot of the task, I think, on the left for organizing is sort of connecting that kind of inchoate general dissatisfaction that the techno-optimist kind of folks seem to don't see or something. They're just like, people want to live exactly the way they live now in both, the global north and the global south. The answer is, I don't see that. I don't see it in surveys. I don't see it in popular protests. So instead, we should be looking at what we actually realistically do have, which is some tech and some older stuff. In the time I was writing this book, for example, like the whole idea of like indigenous farming techniques went from being like a woo-woo hippie thing to being something that like, IPCC authors are like, actually, no, it turns out learning how to do terrace farming and like using less water and actually works really well. Like these are advanced forms of agricultural technology, right? So it's not about no tech versus some tech. Rather, it's about the tech we have and the social forces that might implement the use of those technologies in order to make a more convivial and sustainable, and actually could be quite lovely, as I try to describe in parts of the book, human ecological niche for the vast majority.
This is Brian Edwards-Tiekert. Normally we take a news break right now, but this ain't live. So here's a message from KPFA.
KPFA Radio is a community-powered, listener-supported radio station based in Berkeley, California. We are able to bring you this content through donations and support from our listeners. Please consider supporting KPFA through a donation by visiting www.kpfa.org/donate. And now let's get back to the program.
Welcome back to Upfront. We're spending this hour with Ajay Singh Chaudhary. He's executive director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and just out with a new book entitled The Exhausted of the Earth: Politics in a Burning World. Among the types of political thought that he takes aim at in the book is what he calls techno-optimism and techno-mysticism. Just kind of punting to a black box called technological progress, some of the problems we have to solve quickly if we want to not completely break the systems that the planet uses for supporting human civilization. In his formulation, leaning on that black box does two things. First of all, it lets politicians talk about addressing climate change in a way that doesn't challenge any existing social arrangements. The second thing it does, because of the limits on what's achievable in what time frame with technology, is it tacitly says we're going to let the planet warm up enough to make a whole lot of people, the majority of the world's population, pretty miserable, even though we will preserve the power structures that let a smaller number of people, the wealthy and powerful, stay above the worst consequences. Let's go back to the interview with Ajay Singh Chaudhary. I'm always really perplexed by the fascination with electric cars. On the one hand, internal combustion emissions are a big contributor to climate change. On the other hand, so much carbon gets released, like producing all the
In
parts and
producing
components
them, yeah.
for an electric car, that you're only cutting your per mile emissions by about half.
Yeah. So I'm more than happy to talk about this.
But the technology for electric trains has been around for more than 100 years.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, I don't know about here in the Bay, but I do know that in New York, for example, we also used to have them. Like, so all of New York, including Brooklyn and Queens, I'm not sure about Staten Island, and I have to check on the Bronx where I was born, actually, but like had above ground electrified transit like 100 years ago. And we dismantled it for the car industry. Good job. And EVs, like, don't get me wrong, the life cycle assessment on an EV is better than the life cycle assessment on a internal combustion. So, because I do see some people throw that around.
Assuming it's driven enough and not sitting in your garage.
Oh, yeah,
as a
absolutely.
trophy
Don't get me
Tesla.
wrong. I'm about to get to why I hate the like EVs to solve everything. But yes, like if you look at something like the Biden administration's IRA, so-called climate provisions, I don't even think it is really a climate law. It's not even really an inflation law. It's just a stimulus law, which is, has its uses and its fouls as well, right? But EVs, yes, the idea of like in the U.S., we have a whole society built around the car, and the idea of replacing every currently existing internal combustion engine car with an EV is totally comical. And in fact, people who I know who work more closely, for example, than I do on geology and things like this will actually just be like, that's never going to happen, right?
Good luck finding the lithium.
Yeah, I mean, there is lithium. I mean, there is cadmium, and they're always saying there's going to be a new kind of battery. The thing I always focus on is cobalt because the only usable deposits are in DRC, and they use slaves to get them. But right, like, long story short, even if you could somehow get over all that stuff, yes, at some point you actually sort of basically cross either one of two curves. One curve is I just am now running out of actual materials. It's one of those few bottlenecks where there actually is a limit. A lot of the bottlenecks in the climate space, especially in energy, for example, are the opposite. So it's like we don't have too little oil. This is a big thing like 20 years ago, right? Peak oil.
Right.
We've got too much fossil fuels. But that's not the case with this other stuff. But also the second curve that you cross is a sort of just pure destruction thing, which is especially for people who work on the ground in places. I'll use lithium because that was your example. In South America, it's like how many sacrifice zones can my country handle? And also who gets to decide? And a lot of the fights that are happening down there are about the second question. It's like, okay, we do in fact want to do some of this. It should be very expensive because everyone wants it. But we want to control how much of it is done, how fast, and, the health and safety, all that kind of stuff. And we want to make sure that that value is captured in the South. That's what usually the positions are. And so the idea of replacing every car with an EV runs into all these problems. And yet, as you just pointed out, we don't invest the resources, the money, et cetera, et cetera. When I say resources, I mean physical resources in proven, easy, wonderful solutions. It's like, oh, you could have a bullet train? Like, right. It's somewhat ironic. I'll use myself as an example. I'm happy to always do so. Right, to fly around the country and tell people about climate change and how we shouldn't fly around the country so much. But in fact, if we had nice electrified train transit, as this country should have, there's almost no excuse. The tech is here. It works incredibly well. It is like 8 billion times more efficient. And in fact, there are countries that are like this. Again, especially I like to cite China because they built it in 10 years. That kind of travel totally is happening across actually sometimes much more difficult places. So we have to be asking ourselves, again, not the so-called drop-in solution that recreates this world, but what would allow those other kinds of technologies and ways of living to flourish. And part of my argument here is that you see a lot of people indicating, whether through surveys, whether through behaviors, that they would love to be able to get on a train in Chicago and go to Cincinnati, or go from Cincinnati to Knoxville and then to DC, whatever, right? They would love that instead of getting on a plane or driving their own car. And yet, for the bottom line, we don't do that. And one of the most important things, again, bring it back to sort of organizing, and also I'll throw in political education, is that a step that I think the left hasn't yet really accomplished is being like, there is a guy who makes a lot of money off the fact that your house, keeps getting inundated or that your farm keeps getting inundated. And I don't just mean they make money on the insurance and they make money on the damages. Literally, like, this hurricane is not an act of God. It's not an act of nature, right? This hurricane or this flooding or this change in aridity, that is so Bill or Elon or one of these cats can have, 0.015% more return on their capital investments. And especially for folks who are in the fossil fuel sector, but also many sectors that are quite far afield, their whole profitability model depends upon not just current rates of extraction and growth, but also they've priced in future rates of extraction and growth. So the easiest and most concrete example of this I usually say to folks is fossil fuel companies right now are still building new facilities that will not be profitable for 35 years, depending on what the facility is, right? So they're investing now, assuming that they're still pumping liquid natural gas or whatever it is, oil, far, far into the future. So when you're looking around at what people are doing and what people are saying, the right's not a bunch of loonies, as sometimes they are, but instead they're actually kind of not only taking it very seriously, but they got a leg up on us because they already have a lot of roads to power, in power, et cetera, et cetera.
So I want to return to the Inflation Reduction Act. I take your point. It's not the climate policy that you would draft from whole cloth.
Yeah.
But it did seem meaningful that it broke this 2-decade-long political fascination with just pricing carbon correctly through a cap and trade system or a carbon tax, and actually put the government in the role of doing industrial policy for the first time in half a century. And trying to steer productive investment and also where jobs would be, trying to onshore whole sectors.
It's so interesting because there's so much about this now. And for a long time, especially in the climate space, this sort of industrial policy stuff, it was the thing that many were struggling for, but wanted, especially from the sort of eco-socialist side, being like, that is actually what we want. But there's industrial policy and there's industrial policy. The U.S. industrial policy that the Biden administration has put in place is tied around really 2 or 3, I would say, pillars, if you will. One is that it's largely still investments through existing private corporations. So if I build a system of solar cells, that's maybe, a one-time cost and then some maintenance and maybe you upgrade in a decade or two or whatever. But the profit return on that versus I build you a pipeline and I shove things through the pipeline, right, that I also sell you. You can just hear it, right? It doesn't add up. So the IRA is really sort of geared towards sort of juicing that private investment thing. And actually, we're seeing this fail already all over the country, where a lot of corporations, even with the tax incentives, even with the direct cash transfers, are nah, I don't really want to do this. In New York, we just passed, I think, one of the most advanced climate laws in the country, the Build Public Renewables Act. But the governor and the private corporations are both just being yeah, no, we don't want the money. It's supposed to kick in. The reason I mentioned the governor is that in that law, one of the reasons why it's so good is that if private sector fail, there was actually a provisional law being then the public sector must essentially step in with the equivalent of what in China we just call a state-owned enterprise, right? Mm-hmm. And there are utilities which exist in the middle space. The IRA is centered around de-risking EVs, right? So we're going to just massively produce EVs. Now, this is a huge problem because we're not really set up to massively produce anything that much anymore. And then finally, I would say that, and this is maybe one of the dicier, it's not dicey, but it's controversial. I actually say the IRA is actually not the most significant climate law that the Biden administration has passed, the Democrats and the Biden administration have passed. It would be rather the national security statements. Why do I say this? Because we just had this thing. Janet Yellen did this tour around the world, but especially to China, being you're producing too much photovoltaic, you're going to flood the markets. It's going to be a market distortion. And from the point of view of a kind of neoclassical economic argument, you actually oh, I get why this makes sense, right? It's lowering the cost of photovoltaic. It's basically crowding out the market. They're going to be the only game in town, et cetera, et cetera. But if you take a step back and you think about this from an ecological perspective, especially from like other global South countries, you're like, wait a minute. Don't we want this technology adopted as quickly and as cheaply as humanly possible? And these guys are sitting on it. They're just sitting on it, like miles. In fact, I think that the government the other day here in the U.S. Raided a warehouse to prevent like the distribution of some of this kind of stuff. So long story short, a lot of our national security posture is really built around American economic hegemony in the face of social and ecological need, and out of a sort of drive that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So
let me try to put a different frame on the same set of facts.
Sure, absolutely.
Because I'm disposed to say the same thing. China's making cheap solar panels great. That's exactly what the planet needs. If you are someone who has to worry about the sustainability of the politics behind greening the sector, then you do have some amount of investment in those solar panels coming from factories in the United States that you can point at where, you can do photo ops with workers in hard hats and where you build like a domestic sector that pays for lobbyists and puts money into politics and is a counterweight against the political muscle of the fossil fuel industry. In that case, then you do worry about just having your domestic production wiped out by China because you are giving grist to the people who didn't want to electrify in the first place.
Yeah, it's almost like we should have listened to the ultra-globalization movement 20, 30 years ago. Sorry, I don't know if that's good for the radio or not. No, I couldn't agree more, actually. And unfortunately, there's a couple things here. One, I really, there used to be this like old, song about the hippies versus the hard hats, right? It's actually not as – if you actually dig through the history, which I have, it's actually not that true. In fact, there was a lot of connections between the various movements, especially back in the 60s and 70s, that people have just kind of memory hold that this happened.
Right. Port Huron statement gets drafted in a retreat center owned by the United Auto Workers.
Yeah. I'm like, this is like this idea that there was this like ungulfable gap or something. But yes, now there is a sort of culture war thing about climate for sure. And it is often I think mistakenly sort of shot against this backdrop of the, as you said, the guys in hard hats, and the jobs, because the truth of the matter is, in the United States, our manufacturing sector is sadly quite small. And it's not something we're necessarily going to change right now. There's also a lot of things we need to be building in this country, but it doesn't necessarily mean we need to be building photovoltaic. The example I like to use is actually not as closely climate related as some of the stuff we're talking about, is the CHIPS Act. So the Biden administration, for national security purposes, passed the CHIPS Act and signed the CHIPS Act. But why is it mostly focused on places like Texas? I mean, it's a political thing there as well. But also because Texas has such labor laws and such low pay that it in fact is globally competitive on low price labor. In fact, I believe that the labor price there is lower than, for example, Shenzhen, China. So a lot of this is sadly window dressing. And, if you look at a lot of what's happening, the UAW sort of transformation under Fain has been really, really exciting. But a lot of the expansions and revitalizations within the labor movement have been in service sector unions. And that's sort of like from the Social Science Journal, right? Because of course, that's where most of the American labor force is. But also part of a green transition, people tend to, I think, focus on the tech, focus on the jobs, on the jobs in manufacturing, on the jobs in building. And we need a lot of building done. So there's a lot I talk about of construction work. So there's a lot of hard, serious labor that is needed. But also a green transition is not just an energy transition. It also means sort of supporting and shifting the economic focus to things like what Marxists would call social reproduction, right? So care work, education, social work, all this kind of stuff, which is very hard to outsource, let me put it that way, right? And which is super, super undervalued in our society. Often it's coded feminine, often it's coded non-white. And we need to be looking at why we don't, we know why we don't pay a lot of those things well, but thinking of those as climate jobs and not only the guy who builds the photovoltaic array. And I should say that many of those guys are also girls, right? So we need people doing photovoltaic installations. Are we building it here? Are we building it there? Honestly, I don't care that much. I will just say it is there. And so all that minerals and all the emissions associated with its production, they've already happened. So like from a very practical point of view, I'm just like, okay, well, let's focus on the other stuff then. And I unfortunately don't see any of these laws from the current administration deviating from that kind of hegemonic or jingoistic path towards a more sustainable one, which would in fact require the United States to be a little less globally dominant. And ironically, one of the things I argue in the book, this actually connects back to your earlier observation about sort of like interests, national interests versus, like solidaristic transnational ones. It's really, and I think this moment is very clear about that, a lot of things the U.S. does to maintain its imperial hold upon the world aren't very good for Americans. And Americans don't seem to like it very much either. Good on us. So this one I'm happy about, right? Americans don't seem to be very keen on it. And so we're fighting very hard to hold on to this economic and political primacy that it runs actually against the interests of the vast majority of American citizens.
I think the thing that seems politically tricky to let go of with the techno-optimism is that the alternative is to say there are some limits we have to live within.
That's right.
And it doesn't seem very politically promising to say in some areas you may have to do with less. Yes.
I get into this in the book quite a bit. I mean, there's a couple ways to approach this. And I do think if you were like crafting a campaign, my brother's a propagandist by trade, so I think about propaganda a lot. And in my regular work, I run an education and research institute for working adults. So I'm constantly thinking about how do you communicate, sometimes quite abstract ideas in a classroom full of people who didn't necessarily go to college, something like that, right? So like this is live stuff. This is important stuff. So I do think that sometimes if you want to if you think about mounting a campaign, whether it's an electoral campaign, an extra legal campaign, a community organizing effort, whatever it is, and you're like, I'm going to make you poorer. Yeah, I don't think that's going to work out so well. But as I talk about in the book, if we did just the kind of stuff that is pretty much consensus agreed upon as the good stuff you should do for climate mitigation and adaptation, the economic end result, while it probably wouldn't be by Marxist definitions, the end of capitalism, which actually we should all be kind of happy about in a weird way, because if we actually had to have a full communist revolution before having an energy transition or other climate-related transitions, we'd be pretty because I don't know, history has shown it's not the easiest thing on earth to make a communist revolution. Be that as it may, even if we still have roughly a heavily managed capitalism, let's call it, or I would call it eco-socialism, but I'll let people fight about the words. I actually really don't care, to be perfectly honest. If we are looking at something like that, on the basic numbers, right? So we're going to be doing you're probably doing socialized housing. You're certainly doing socialized services like healthcare and other things. You're doing things like the electrified transport we just talked about with trains. You're investing in social reproductive services, so education, libraries. If you look at the numbers, probably a shorter work week. You're looking at people actually doing better. The median American per capita is just doing better on the pure numbers. And that's without getting into the qualitative stuff, where the people are like, oh, this is a slower, more enjoyable pace of life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But also I do towards the end of the book, and it's quite fun because I get to pull all these right-wing surveys. I think one of my favorites is, I want to say it's from the Heritage Foundation, but maybe it's from one of the other right-wing think tanks, I forget which was about the American dream. And they're like, and the headlines, the one they sent to the papers is, oh, Americans still believe in the American dream. Well, yay. But then if you looked at the actual numbers and questions they asked, most people were not identifying the American dream with owning 2 cars and a house and this, that, and the other. They're like, oh, the American dream is I live near green spaces. There's a good school system. I live in a good school district. I live near a 7-day-a-week public library, right? These are the kinds of things that a lot of people are indicating are missing from their lives that they want. And this is so sustainable. And the other side of this that I always like to highlight is I do feel like environmentalists, especially in the past, it's still to this day, often will present the sort of limits, right, as these kind of noble sacrifices that we make, right? So we're going to live in sackcloth, but it's kind of weird Christian. I'm not Christian, right? It gives me kind of the heebie-jeebies a little bit. Whereas, and again, I can't take credit for this one. I think this one was Kate Aronoff originally said this at an event I was at, where it was like, do you like drinking beer? Do you like going to the beach? You know what's a low carbon fun activity? Drinking beer on the beach, right? Like we don't have to always, I point a lot into the book about like really grand and fantastic things we could be doing in spaces that are hard to transition, like air travel. I talk about like blimps and stuff like this that people are working on right now. It's awesome stuff. But also we're not only talking about this sort of like noble stuff, like, and believe me, I believe in the ability of education and of social services and of healthcare, like till kingdom come. Don't get me wrong. But we're also talking about a bunch of prosaic things that actually people deeply enjoy. I think there is a way of communicating that actually a lot of your current privation, a lot of the things that make you currently, again, exhausted or overrun or overwrought or just like any number of ways that like the world feels to be running away from you. All of this book is about speed, right? Are also the things that are destroying the planet and are undermining our ecosystems. So it's in fact, not only is this sort of good, green, sustainable, it's sustainable for you. It's a better life for you. It's not just like a less bad life or something like this. It's just categorically better. And the phrase I love to use, and actually I've been pleasantly surprised doing these book talks, that I get so many engineers being like, yes, thank you. Thank you for sort of going away from this techno-optimist line. No, we don't need a new iPhone next year. Please don't make me write the OS for it. Please don't make me update the apps. And instead thinking about limits as enabling constraints, as these extraordinary sort of things into which we can design a better world.
Yeah. No, we don't need to keep the coal-fired power plant running so that we can mine Bitcoin.
Oh, my God. And don't even get me started. I think I make the joke in the book about that, right? The fastest way to turn something useful into something useless.
Ajay Singh Chaudhary, it's a great book. Thank you so much for talking to us about it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Ajay Singh Chaudhary is Executive Director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. His new book is The Exhausted of the Earth, Politics in a Burning World.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you want to find more KPFA radio content, log on to www.kpfa.org. Also follow us on social media by visiting Facebook at KPFA 94.1 and Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at KPFA Radio. Plus, check out our KPFA TV video content on YouTube and twitch.tv at KPFA Radio. Subscribe to this podcast and stay updated to when we release episodes of shows representing the best of KPFA Radio.